Imagine being a highly decorated pilot in the United States Air Force, known for your skill and service, but having your authority questioned by a security officer at a routine checkpoint. That's exactly what happened to Captain James, a Black USAF pilot, when he was subjected to a humiliating encounter that no one saw coming. As Captain James approached the airport security, he was already feeling the weight of his long flight. But what should have been a simple process turned into something much more intense. The security officer, seemingly skeptical of his military ID, decided to make the situation unnecessarily difficult. Despite James's calm and respectful demeanor, the officer insisted on questioning his identity and purpose in an abrasive and unprofessional manner. It wasn't long before the officer's actions crossed a line and the situation escalated. But what the security officer didn't expect was that Captain James wasn't just any pilot. He was trained to handle high-pressure situations with poise. In the next moments, the officer would quickly realize that humiliating a USAF pilot was a mistake he would regret. Stay tuned to find out how this intense standoff ends and what happens when the tables turn. Captain James had served in the Air Force for over a decade. He had flown combat missions, trained countless others, and earned multiple commendations. Despite his achievements, he had always remained humble, understanding the weight of his uniform but never letting it define him. Being a black man in the military came with its challenges, but James had learned to navigate through both the respect and the subtle prejudices that came with his position. That day, however, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off as he stood in line at the security checkpoint. The officer, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, glanced at James's military ID with a suspicious squint. He asked a few standard questions, but there was an odd tone in his voice, something almost accusatory. The officer's questions felt less like routine security checks and more like a deliberate attempt to undermine James's authority. Other passengers moved through the line smoothly, but James found himself stuck under the officer's cold gaze. It wasn't just the officer's attitude that felt off. It was the way his questions seemed to challenge James's very existence in that uniform. The situation was beginning to feel like more than just an ordinary security check. Something bigger was at play here, and James could sense it. What would happen next? James could feel the eyes of other passengers on him as the officer continued his questioning. The hum of the busy airport around them faded into a dull background noise. It was as if the whole world was watching this moment unfold. The officer was still holding James' ID, turning it over in his hands, scrutinizing it like it was a counterfeit. The unease in James's chest grew. It wasn't just the way the officer looked at him. It was the assumption that he had something to hide. "Where exactly are you headed, Captain?" the officer asked, his voice sharp, almost condescending. James, who had already stated his destination when he handed over his ID, answered again, his patience beginning to fray. "I told you, I'm headed to San Antonio for a training exercise. I'm a pilot with the USAF," he said, trying to keep his tone calm. But the officer didn't seem satisfied. He motioned for James to step aside. Behind them, the line of people shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves. James knew what they were thinking. He could feel the eyes of a few passengers narrowing, a few others shifting uncomfortably. He could almost hear the questions they were asking themselves. Asterisk, why is he being treated this way? Asterisk. The officer's actions were more than just an inconvenience. They felt like a subtle attack on James's credibility. It wasn't just about the ID or even the questions. It was about challenging everything James had earned. For a moment, he considered just letting it go, letting the officer continue with his charade, but something inside him pushed back. Why should he be forced to prove his worth when he already had so much to show for it? The officer's tone grew more insistent. I'm going to need you to come with me for further screening. James's pulse quickened. This wasn't normal procedure, and something in the officer's eyes told him this was personal. But before James could respond, a voice broke through the tension. A fellow security officer, walking toward them, clearly aware of the standoff. Was it a coincidence? Or had someone noticed what was going on? The tension was thick in the air as James stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. The officer's grip on his ID tightened, and for a moment, James felt a wave of anger rise within him. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was a matter of dignity. James glanced around, feeling the weight of the crowd's eyes on him. Some were still whispering, but there was an uneasy silence now, like everyone was holding their breath. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps approaching, but his focus remained fixed on the officer in front of him. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, the second security officer arrived. The newcomer was younger, her uniform slightly disheveled, as though she'd been called away from another part of the airport. She took one look at the situation, immediately sensing the brewing storm. Her eyes flicked between James and the officer who had been questioning him, her brow furrowing as she asked, "What's going on here?" The first officer hesitated for a moment, his grip on James's ID still firm. "This man's ID doesn't check out," he said, voice flat, but there was a trace of uncertainty in his words. James could feel the weight of the situation shift. The second officer looked at James with a mix of confusion and suspicion. But then something shifted in her eyes. She quickly pulled out her own phone, tapping a few times before holding it up to the first officer. "His ID is fine," she said firmly. "I've just verified it. You need to let him go." The first officer's face flushed. He clearly wasn't expecting the challenge. His gaze flickered nervously, but he didn't back down right away. James could tell the man wasn't accustomed to being questioned like this. The officer stepped back slightly, still holding James's ID, as if trying to regain control of the situation. The tension hummed thick in the air, neither side willing to fully yield. It was as if the world had come to a halt, every second dragging on, and James could feel the heat of frustration rising within him. Would the officer let him go, or would this escalate even further? The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, and James knew he was standing on the edge. Just as James thought the tension might finally be breaking, a sudden, sharp voice cut through the air. "What's going on here?" It wasn't the second officer, but a third security official, a senior figure who had clearly just arrived on the scene. His uniform was immaculate, and his face was set in an expression that was a mix of authority and suspicion. The newcomer scanned the situation in an instant, his eyes flicking between James, the first officer, and the second officer, who was still holding her phone. James could feel his pulse racing again, sensing that something wasn't right. The senior officer's eyes lingered on James for a moment too long. It was clear he wasn't just observing the scene. He was reading between the lines, calculating something. "Sir, there's been a mistake," the second officer said, her voice steady, but not without a hint of urgency. "This man's ID checks out. He's a member of the Air Force, just traveling for a training exercise." The senior officer didn't acknowledge her right away. Instead, he turned his attention to James. "What's your name, soldier?" he asked, his tone now colder, more calculating. James gave his full name, just as he had earlier, but the officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he seemed to deliberate for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then, without warning, the officer pulled out a device from his belt, something James hadn't seen before, and began typing rapidly. A sinking feeling spread in James's stomach. The officer's fingers were moving so quickly, and there was a sudden intensity to his actions that made James uneasy. Was this some kind of new procedure? Seconds later, the officer's gaze locked onto James's face. and the tension in the air thickened to an unbearable level. "Captain James," the senior officer said, his voice now dripping with an unsettling calm. "You're not just any pilot, are you? You've been flagged." James froze. He had no idea what the officer was talking about. "Flagged?" he repeated, his voice tight. The officer nodded slowly, his expression hardening. "You're under investigation, Captain. You've been flagged by higher authorities." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. James felt his breath catch in his throat. Asterisk investigation. Asterisk, he had no idea what the officer was referring to. Was this some kind of mistake? But before he could respond, the senior officer gave a small, almost imperceptible signal, and suddenly the situation went from tense to downright hostile. The first officer stepped forward, his hand hovering near his sidearm. James's heart raced. The walls were closing in, and now more than ever, it seemed like there was something much bigger at play, something he couldn't see coming. James stood frozen, his mind racing as the officers closed in on him. The seconds dragged on, and he could feel the eyes of everyone around him, passengers, staff, even the second officer, watching the tense standoff. The air was thick with uncertainty,